When I told my son I was going to marry a woman from the Philippines, he went quiet on the phone for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, in that careful voice he uses when he's trying not to hurt my feelings, "Dad, I'm really worried about you." That was the beginning of the most difficult year of my life, and also, if I'm being honest, the best one. I should tell you a little about who I was before any of this happened, because context matters. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years installing and servicing heating and cooling systems in houses across Gray County. I retired at 61 when my knees finally told me they were done with ladders. I live in a farmhouse about 20 minutes outside Owen Sound, Ontario. Bought it with my late wife in 1989. Raised 2 kids there, watched them leave. My wife, Carol, passed away 8 years ago from ovarian cancer. We had 27 years together. After she was gone, I rattled around in that house for a long time, trying to figure out what a person does with the second half of their life when the person they planned it with isn't there anymore. For a while, the answer was nothing much. I had my morning coffee on the back porch, watched the fields, drove into town, stopped at the Legion on Fridays. My son Ryan worked out in Fort McMurray doing pipeline inspection, and my daughter Elise was in Ottawa working for the federal government. They called regularly, visited when they could. It was a decent life, quiet, but the kind of quiet that doesn't quite leave room for anything new. I started using Facebook more than I probably should have, the way retired people do when the days get long. I joined a few groups, local history, vintage farm equipment, some birding groups Carol used to follow, and then one afternoon, in a group about heritage breeds of chickens that I'd stumbled into by accident, a woman named Rowena left a comment on a photo I'd posted of my Rhode Island Reds. She said they were the same breed her grandmother had kept on their property in Ilocos Norte, and asked if I'd ever let them free range or kept them penned. I answered. She replied that was it, nothing dramatic. She wasn't trying to introduce herself to a lonely Canadian man. She was talking about chickens, and maybe that's the part that matters most. Looking back, it didn't feel like a setup because it wasn't one. We kept talking, first in the comments, then in Messenger. Rowena was a community health worker in Laoag City, helping coordinate vaccination programs and home visits for elderly residents in the barangays around the city. She had a daughter named Pia who was 12, and a mother she'd been caring for since her father passed. She wasn't looking for anything from me and made no suggestion that she was. We talked about farming, about community work, about the differences between a Manitoba winter and an Ilocos dry season, about what it means to take care of land that's been in your family for generations. She'd grown up on a small farm. So had I. That seemed like enough to keep a conversation going. Months passed. Somewhere in there, the conversation stopped being about chickens. I won't pretend I understood what was happening while it was happening. I was 62 years old and hadn't been in any kind of relationship since Carol died. I didn't think of myself as the sort of man who falls in love over Facebook Messenger with a woman he's never met who lives on the other side of the world. But here's what I know now. What we built during those months wasn't built on loneliness or fantasy. It was built on an enormous number of ordinary conversations about ordinary things, and slowly, without either of us planning it, we had become the kind of people who wanted to tell each other things. There was one evening I remember clearly. I'd had a frustrating day. The furnace in the old farmhouse had been giving me trouble, and even though I'm retired, I can't stop myself from trying to fix these things, and I'd made the problem worse before making it better. I told Rowena about it, complaining more than I should have. She laughed. Not at me exactly, but with a kind of warmth that made being laughed at feel perfectly fine. She said her own house had a leaking roof. She'd been patching with plastic sheeting for 2 years because the right materials were too expensive, and that maybe we were both too stubborn to ask for help. I laughed too, and after we said goodnight, I sat on my back porch in the dark for a while and realized I hadn't felt that easy in someone else's company since Carol. That realization scared me a little. I pushed it aside for a few more months. But eventually I had to admit something to myself. There was a conversation I was dreading, and the fact that I was dreading it told me something important about what I actually felt. I hadn't said anything to Ryan or Elise yet. I wasn't sure how to begin. I started with Elise, because she's easier to talk to. She listened carefully, asked a few thoughtful questions, and said she trusted my judgment, but that she'd feel better when she learned more about Rowena. That was fair. That was very Elise. Ryan was a different conversation. He called on a Sunday, the way he always does, and I told him while we were still on the easy part of the call, before hockey scores and Fort McMurray weather. I told him I'd been talking regularly with a woman in the Philippines, that it had been going on for nearly a year, and that I had real feelings for her. The silence on the other end was long. Then, Dad, you've never met this person. I know that. You've been sending her messages for a year, and you've never actually been in the same room with her. I know that too. Have you sent her money? No. Has she asked for money? No. Has she told you she loves you? We hadn't used that word yet, I told him honestly. Another silence. Then, Dad, I've read about this. I've seen it happen to guys at work. They meet someone online, they think it's real, and then it turns out the woman has a whole network behind her. It's a business. These guys lose their RRSPs. They lose their houses. I told him I understood why he was worried. I told him I'd had those same thoughts myself. Then why are you still doing this? That was the question I couldn't answer well over the phone. Because the honest answer would have taken an hour, and I wasn't sure he was in a place to hear it. We ended the call politely, but when I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Ryan wasn't saying anything cruel. He was saying what any son would say. He'd watched me carry Carol's illness for 3 years and then carry her loss for 8 more. He didn't want to watch me get hurt again in a completely different way. I understood that. What I couldn't figure out was whether understanding it meant I should listen to it. I didn't tell Rowena about that conversation for almost 2 weeks. Every time we talked, I'd think about bringing it up, and then something would happen. She'd tell me something funny about a rooster one of her elderly patients kept trying to give her as a thank you gift. Or she'd ask about the ice on Georgian Bay, and I'd put it off again. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But really I was afraid of what her reaction would tell me. When I finally said it, we'd been talking for about 40 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. I took a breath and told her what Ryan had said. I told her I'd been reading things online too, the articles and the warning posts. I told her that some of it had gotten into my head more than I wanted to admit. She didn't say anything right away. Then she asked quietly, "Do you think he's right?" I told her the truth. I said I didn't believe she was running any kind of scheme, but I also couldn't honest say none of the doubt had reached me. What she said next is something I've thought about 100 times since. She said, if our situations were reversed, and someone I'd never met was sending me messages from another country for a year, and my son told me to be careful, I'd want him to say exactly that. That's what children do when they love you. I didn't know what to say to that. She kept going, not defensively, just quietly. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your family. I would never ask you to do that. What I'm asking is that you don't decide who I am based on what someone else imagines I might be. Give yourself the chance to find out. I sat with that for a long time after we said goodnight. She wasn't asking me to ignore common sense. She wasn't asking me to trust her blindly or to prove my loyalty by cutting my son off. She was simply asking to be judged by her own actions. And something about the way she said it, without any trace of hurt, without any manipulation, told me more about her character than anything I'd heard in the previous year. I bought a plane ticket 2 weeks later, Toronto to Manila, Manila to Laoag. It cost me just under $2,000 return, which is not an insignificant amount on a pension. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel the weight of it. But I'd been watching the airline websites for months, opening and closing the tabs. And at some point, you have to stop watching and do something. The flight from Toronto to Manila is nearly 20 hours with the layover. By the time I landed in Laoag and walked through the small arrivals hall, I had been traveling for the better part of a day and a half, and I looked exactly as terrible as you'd expect. That's the first thing Rowena said when she saw me. Not hello. Not I'm glad you made it. She looked at me for a second, smiled, and said, "You look like you slept inside your luggage." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my carry-on. We drove into Laoag in a jeepney her cousin was driving. She'd arranged it ahead of time, and the whole way she pointed out things along the road and told me their names in Ilocano. I didn't retain any of it. I was just glad to be there. Glad that she was exactly who she'd sounded like. The first few days were ordinary, in the way that only matters when you pay attention. We visited her mother, a small woman with sharp eyes who sat me down, gave me a glass of fresh coconut water, and asked through Rowena's translation whether I intended to take her daughter away to Canada. I told her honestly that I hadn't thought that far ahead, that I was here to meet Rowena and see whether what we'd built over a phone screen made any sense in person. Her mother looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once, and went back to shelling beans. I noticed things that I wouldn't have noticed if I'd been trying to prove something. The way Rowena spoke to her patients on the days I came along on her rounds, not with the slightly elevated professional voice people sometimes use with the elderly, but just naturally, the same voice she used with everyone. The way she noticed things, a neighbor's gate sagging off its hinge, a child sitting alone outside during school hours. She'd make a quiet note or say something gently. It wasn't performance, it was just attention. There was one afternoon I haven't told many people about. We were at a small market near the plaza, buying tomatoes and some dried fish she was bringing to her mother, when an elderly man dropped a heavy sack of rice near the entrance. He was thin, probably in his 80s, and the bag was clearly more than he should have been carrying. Before I even registered what was happening, Rowena had put down what she was holding, walked over, and helped him carry the sack to a cart waiting 20 feet away. She talked to him while she did it. Then she came back, picked up her things, and started telling me something about whether I'd tried pinakbet yet, as if nothing particular had happened. She hadn't done it for me to see. She'd done it because the man needed help and she was there. There's no other explanation, because she didn't know I was watching, and she never mentioned it afterward. Neither did I. But I remembered. Leaving was harder than I'd expected. I knew it would be difficult, but I hadn't fully understood how difficult until I was standing outside the departure's entrance at Laoag Airport with my bag at my feet and nothing left to say that felt adequate. We stood there for a while talking about small things, my connecting time in Manila, whether I had enough Philippine pesos left for water at the airport, anything except what was actually happening. Eventually I had to go. I hugged her, picked up my bag, walked through the door. I looked back once. Rowena was standing exactly where I'd left her, hands in her jacket pockets, watching. She waved. That image stayed with me for the entire flight home. Coming back to the farmhouse in Owen Sound in late February was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The same furniture, the same smell of the old wood stove, the same sound of wind coming off the escarpment at night. But I kept reaching for my phone to tell Rowena things she wasn't there to hear. The first sunset I saw back home, I took a picture without thinking about it. My friend Pete asked me how the trip went about a week after I got back. Pete and I have known each other for 30 years. He's not a suspicious man, not a worrier. But even Pete said carefully, "So do you have a clearer picture now?" And I realized the world around me was still drawing the same conclusions, still waiting to hear that I'd found something wrong. I told him it felt like I'd finally met someone I'd known for a long time. He looked unconvinced. Then he asked, "She's not planning to move to Ontario, is she?" I told him I wasn't sure anymore. That was the right question. Before the trip, I'd assumed, without really examining the assumption, that if things worked out, the next step was obvious. Sponsorship application through IRCC, the immigration process, a temporary resident permit while we waited, then permanent residency. Bring her to Canada. That's how it works. That's what you do. But Rowena had never once talked about coming to Canada. Not once in over a year of conversations. She talked about her work. She talked about her mother, who needed care and wasn't well enough to travel. She talked about Pia's school and the barangay clinic they were trying to expand. She talked about her life, not as something she was trying to leave, but as something she was actively building. There was never a request hidden inside any of those conversations. No suggestion that she was waiting for me to offer her a way out. That made me uncomfortable, not because it was a problem, but because it made me realize I'd been carrying an assumption I'd never thought to examine. I'd been thinking about what this would cost me, whether I could trust her, whether she'd be happy here, how the immigration timeline would work, without asking the more obvious question, which was whether I was the one being asked to rethink something. I went back to Laoag in June, then again in October. By the third visit, Pia, who had turned 14 and had strong opinions about everything, had decided she could tolerate me. She'd been polite and guarded on the first 2 visits, watching me the way a kid watches something she's learned not to get attached to. By the third visit, she started asking me questions directly, about Canada, about hockey, about why Canadians apologize so constantly. I told her we were legally required to at birth. She stared at me for a second. Then she laughed, and that was the end of the distance between us. Ryan came around more slowly. He called one Sunday in August, a few months after my second trip, and the call lasted close to 2 hours. He asked every question he'd been holding since the first conversation. About my RRSP, about the property, about what the immigration process would actually look like, about health care coverage. I answered all of it as honestly as I could. I told him I wasn't naive. I told him I'd paid close attention to things that were hard to fake. I also told him what would be genuinely difficult about this: the distance from my grandchildren when they eventually come, the cost of flights back and forth, the reality that building any kind of life across 12,000 kilometers requires more patience than most people budget for. There was a pause. Then he said, "You're being more careful than I expected." I told him I wasn't 28. I'd had enough life to know the difference between being swept up in something and making a considered choice. Another pause. Then, "I still want to meet her before anything's official." I told him that was completely fair. I told him I would have said exactly the same thing. Life tested us the way it tests everything, not all at once, but incrementally. There were hard weeks. There were video calls where one of us was exhausted and the conversation went flat. There were mornings when I felt the full weight of what we were trying to build across so much distance. And I'd sit at the kitchen table wondering whether I was being stubborn rather than brave. On one of those nights, I actually typed out a message to Rowena that I never sent. Something along the lines of, "I don't know if I can keep asking this much of both of us." I sat with that message for 20 minutes. Then I deleted it and called her instead. She answered on the third ring. She could tell from my voice that something was off. She didn't ask right away what was wrong. She started talking about her day. A patient who had refused his blood pressure medication for 3 months had finally agreed to try again, and the whole health team had done a small, slightly awkward little celebration in the clinic hallway. She told me the story with all the small details. By the time she finished, I was laughing. Then she said quietly, "Now, tell me what's going on." I told her, all of it. She listened. When I finished, she said something I've held on to since. The distance is real. The difficulty is real. Those things don't disappear. But I know the difference between a hard night and a wrong decision, and I think you do too. That's why you called instead of going to sleep. She was right. I did know the difference. I just needed to hear someone say it out loud. Ryan flew to Laoag with me the following spring. I was nervous in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not about Rowena, but about Ryan. About whether he would see what I'd seen, or whether he would arrive already having decided. He's a good man, my son. He genuinely tried to keep an open mind after our long call. But good intentions don't always survive a first impression. He didn't say much on the first day. He watched. That's what Ryan does. He's an observer before he's a talker, always has been. He watched how Rowena organized her day. He watched how her mother was with her. He watched how Pia rolled her eyes at a joke Rowena made and then immediately felt guilty about it and laughed to cover the guilt. He watched the way Rowena made room for him at dinner without making it obvious she was doing it. The way she answered his questions directly without performing warmth she didn't feel. On the third day, he came and found me on the small patio off the back of Rowena's mother's house, where I'd taken to having my coffee in the mornings. He sat down across from me, quiet for a minute. Then he said, "She's not what I pictured." I asked him what he'd pictured. He thought about it. "I don't know. Someone more obviously trying. She's just a person." "Yeah," I said, "she is." He looked out at the garden. Then, "I think I owe you an apology, Dad." I told him he didn't. I told him he'd done exactly what he was supposed to do. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "I think I might come back here on my own sometime. See a bit more of the place." That was all he said about it. We finished our coffee and went inside. Someone asked me not long ago whether I have any regrets. It's a question I've turned over quite a bit, because the honest answer isn't as simple as no. I miss being able to drive 20 minutes to see Ryan when he's back from Fort McMurray. I miss being nearby when Elise needs something. There are mornings here when I wake up, and the heat is something I still haven't fully made my peace with, and I miss the sound of wind coming off Georgian Bay in October. Missing those things is real, and I don't see the point in pretending otherwise. But I also know what would have happened if I'd let fear make the decision. I'd still be in that farmhouse in Owen Sound, having my coffee on the back porch, watching the fields. It wouldn't have been a bad life, but I'd be living it with one question I could never quite shake. What if they were wrong? I don't have to wonder about that anymore. Ryan sends Rowena voice messages now. He started a few weeks after he got back to Alberta. Apparently, he wanted to learn some Ilocano before his next trip, and she offered to help. He sends her these very serious little recordings, asking how to say ordinary things, and she sends back recordings of herself trying not to laugh while she corrects his pronunciation. It's the most consistent effort he's put into learning anything outside work in years. Elise has already booked her flight for March. Pia told me the last time we talked that she might want to study environmental science in Canada someday. Then she said, "But I might not. I haven't decided." I told her that sounded about right. The people who warned me weren't wrong for wanting to protect me. I understand that better now than I did when I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to answer Ryan's questions over the phone. If someone I cared about were making a decision like this, I'd probably worry too. The difference is that today I tell them something different than what everyone told me. I tell them to pay attention, to take their time, to watch how a person behaves when there's nothing at stake. Character doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small moments when nobody is looking, and if you're paying attention, you'll recognize it when it does. Once you've paid that kind of attention, then make your own decision. Not your son's, not the comment sections, not mine. Rowena is in the kitchen right now. I can hear her talking to her mother, the rhythm of Ilocano rising and falling through the window. In a little while we'll have lunch together, and then she'll go do her afternoon rounds, and I'll spend an hour on the back porch, trying to identify the bird that's been in the banana tree every afternoon for 3 weeks, and that I still can't find in any field guide. It's a quiet life. It doesn't look like much from the outside. But it's mine, and I chose it with both eyes open, and I have never once wished I'd chosen differently.